forgive me, I recognise some faces, but I have to have my wife here with me to prompt me on names, so if I look a bit blank, I'm sure hopefully you'll understand. Technically, Pedigree had the licence from Express newspapers under then Lord Hollick's from 1992 through to 2003. So it's a little bit like, for me, a little bit like all our yesterdays, all our very fond yesterdays, looking back on the time that we had with Rupert. And I heard John, I was smiling as I sat at the side there, listening to some of John's comments and anecdotes. He's encyclopedic, of all these things that's Rupert. So my knowledge of Rupert doesn't bear any scrutiny by comparison with John's. But certainly for a period of 12, 13 years, we were at the heart of Rupert and its development. And in those days, it was under a lady called Sue McGeever, and Sue was the head of the commercial side of Express newspapers. Different world to perhaps the world that became under Richard Desmond. But Sue McGeever was there. Ian Robinson, whom I'm sure I know all of you know, wrote the Rupert stories. John Harold did the front covers and a lot of the interiors. And I'm happy to say that during that time, the lion's share of everything that was done was original material. Towards the end, it got a little bit more difficult to do that, and there was reprints of traditional stories. But just before I come on to that, I should tell you that I'm absolutely delighted to be here at Kelly College. We have 3 sons, and 2 of them who are certainly the men. One of them's been married, now divorced. The other 2 are married, which in today's world seems a wee bit unusual. 2 of the oldest ones went to Kelly. So for a period of about 7 years, the rat run from Torquay, which is where my home is, across the moors at Ashburton, I experienced it again today. It wasn't quite as pleasant today as I try to remember it was a few years ago. It was second nature to us. And by another weird coincidence, just at the end of the Second World War, notwithstanding my Scottish accent, my mum was English, and she was nanny to the Reverend Westall, and the Reverend Westall was principal of Kelly College at the end of the Second World War. So for me, it's like a home from home. I love the place, and I was speaking a little bit to Charles about whether this is going to become your venue. I think if you live in the south of England, it's a delightful venue. If you live in the north and the Midlands, it's maybe more questionable. But it's just a beautiful part of the world. You're seeing it at its best this weekend. Anyway, we're here to focus on that. Rupert, we're not here to focus on the venue, Kelly College, delightful as it is. I guess, like most people, my first introduction to Rupert was as a kiddie. And in those days, I was born in 1947. So, just after the war, and comic strips and newspapers were the name of the game. And myself and my school friends followed Rupert daily in the Scottish Daily Express, which is where our home was. And we loved it. There was something always magical, always gripping about it. At the weekends, we used to follow the Sunday Post for the Bruins and Oor Willie, which was the other alternative that we had up there. And comics were really, as far as we were concerned, just coming in. So we were absolutely obsessed on a daily basis. It wasn't my paper. I mean, the notion of somebody of my age getting a paper was completely beyond me in those days. But it was my father's paper. Father used to always have the Scottish Daily Express, and I couldn't wait for it to arrive to get the latest daily update on Rupert. That was then followed at Christmas by compilations of the stories into the Rupert Annual. I can't remember how many years, but certainly I would say from the age of about 3 or 4 up to the age of about 14 or 15, I used to get in my Christmas stocking a Rupert Annual every single year. And again, I'm sure that's true for a lot of people here today. I I could not remotely have imagined in those days that at a later point, somehow I would be involved with Rupert. People like John Harrell. I must say at the time when I was growing up, I never focused on John Harrell. I was not interested in who the writers were or who the artists were. I was only interested in the stories. You know, that was really where my head was at. But I couldn't believe or envisage for a moment that somehow I would be at the heart of Rupert for a period of 12, 13 years. And we published the first Rupert annual under Lord Hollick's and the Express in 1992. It was the 1992 Rupert annual that was published. And at that time, we had formed a joint venture company called Annual Concepts. I don't know if anybody spotted that in some of the the history of Rupert. But before it moved on to be Pedigree Books in 1993, for 1 year it was Annual Concepts, and that was the joint venture company. And it was with a chap, a delightful man called Michael Thomas, who was previously the publisher of Purnell. You can remember Purnell children's books, anybody can remember that. And Michael was, again, in the same way as John, about children's literature. Michael was encyclopedic and he just loved it and adored it. And Rupert was one of his absolute favourite characters. So Michael brought to us the possibility of getting involved in children's publishing. I had previously, in another life, I had previously been involved with a company called Kentos, who had what is now Egmont, perversely, under them. This was a mini conglomerate back in the 1970s, 1980s, early 80s. So I'd been involved with a company called Wardlock and then World Distributors, if anybody remembers those sort of names from the past. I'd been involved with publishing, but I'd been away from it. The main areas that I was involved with was the toy business. And Michael and I had met up, first of all, in Pentos, and Michael brought the idea of publishing Rupert to us. And I'd like to tell you that it was us that did the negotiation with the then Express. It wasn't. It was actually Michael who did it all. And he had a partner. I was trying to remember his second name, I'm afraid I can't. His first name was John. But the two of them were in partnership together, and they brought the idea to us, and we actually helped fund the start of what was Pedigree Books, originally called Annual Concepts. Very, very sadly, Michael died a few years later, prematurely, from a disastrous health issue. But that was the start. Now, in the early days, we wanted to take charge of Rupert because we thought we were the smart marketeers who understood exactly what to do. And we wanted branding and we wanted all the rest of it, our branding on the front of the books. And in the very best sense, a lot of that was taboo. You could have a sensible conversation with Sue and with Ian, less so with John, because John was based in France at that time, and we used to sort of transport all the artwork back and forward of between us and there. But we had conversations about how the book should be. We certainly didn't want to remotely cut back in contents. If anything, we wanted to do more in terms of contents with it. But Lord Hollick's, ably assisted by Sue, she could be quite formidable, on occasion, was very, very protective of everything that was Rupert. And although we managed to get, we think, in fact I know we got the quality, we managed to get the quality up, we managed to get the sales very substantially up during the 12, 13 years that we had Rupert. An awful lot of what would be called the core values of Rupert were absolutely stuck with during that period of time. And I like to think if you look at some of the titles, it was mainly annuals that we produced, although we did also, for a period, produce facsimiles of previous annuals, and we would put them in we started fairly ad hoc fashion, just brought it out 1 year, and we learned on the job how to do it. And eventually, after 2 or 3 years, what we had in terms of facsimile was printed on very special paper that was as close as you could reasonably get it to the original paper. You know, in a perverse way, you had to have poor quality paper, which sounds easy to get. Actually, when you got up to the 1990s, it was hard to get poor quality paper to print on. If anything, it was much more expensive than the new paper of that time. But we did that, and I heard John earlier talking about the challenges for Rupert. When we took Rupert on, Rupert was having challenges in those days as well. The world we live in today, I have to scratch my head a little bit to try and remotely understand the pace of it, the whole transient nature of it, and that brings greater challenges and greater issues for characters such as Rupert. But we had challenges in those days. The annual, which had originally been John will probably be able to quote the exact number, but in the early 50s, the annual was selling as much as 1 million copies. John?
Oh, easily, yes.
1 million copies, and it was all sold in the UK and the old Commonwealth. The places for Rupert were particularly Australia, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, those English-speaking parts of the old Commonwealth. 1 million copies. When we took it over in 1992, it was doing a very respectable 65-70,000 copies. And largely through the hard work of a lot of people, not least the people in Pedigree as well as the people in Express, when we finished in 2003 or thereabouts, we were turning over from memory about 140,000 copies, which meant that Rupert at that time was year after year the number 2, number 3 annual in the UK. So it really regained an awful lot of its former status, celebrity. It was filling Christmas stockings the way it filled my stocking generations before. In 2000, I think it was about I can't remember the exact date, but in early 2000s, Richard Desmond and Northern and Shell took over Express newspapers, and it was a pretty audacious deal that they did. And in the newspaper world, it's all about numbers of copies. And the whole style of the 2 newspapers that Express produced, one was the Daily Star and the other was the Daily Express, between them in those days amounted to about 1.2 million copies a day. At 1.2 million copies, you can make a lot of money in the newspaper business, particularly if there are common denominators. Richard Desmond, he wasn't my favourite character, isn't my favourite character, but he literally paid, I think they paid about 115 million for the whole kit and caboodle, and I think in the first 12 months they had actually paid back 115 million that they borrowed to do it. So that's a great testament in many ways to the strength of what the Express newspaper group was at that time. But it was a very fat group. It had lots of demarcation principles. It was probably substantially overstaffed on the production and in the editorial and the management side. And Richard Devon came in, and I don't agree with about most things that he did, but I have to say the principle of actually tailoring the organisation to match its then declined turnover, you have to say was probably the right thing commercially to do. But it meant it was a bit of a night of the long nights in the Express, and at that time we started negotiations with Express newspapers originally to buy Rupert. The 2 main characters that Express newspapers had. One was Giles, which was, still one of my favourite characters, but, Giles had died about 15 years before, so it was, the annuals for Giles were remakes of, or recompilations of strip that he had put in. But there's some, real talent. It's like looking at the Rupert artwork and the storylines. There's some wonderful storylines, magical storylines there. And the same is true for Giles. But I'm absolutely convinced to this day that Richard Desmond and Northern Michelle hadn't a clue that when they bought Express newspapers that they bought Rupert and Giles as part and parcel of the what's an old package, if you like, that they took over. Anyway, we opened up conversation with them. We were paying them by industry standards, a rich royalty. We were paying them, again from memory, about 16%. The royalty rates that you would be paying in the publishing industry in those days for a top character would be about 12%, roughly that, and the norm would be probably around 10%. We were paying about 16%, but it was a safe 16%. We knew that we would recover. We were paying them a cheque each year for about £200,000 in total. Now bear in mind that's in the 90s. It's a lot of money today, but it was being the good Presbyterian I am, it was a damn sight more in the 90s than it is today. Yeah. So we offered to buy Rupert from them, and we thought we were making a generous offer. We offered about £2 million to buy out the intellectual property and the trademarks that were Rupert. We were less interested in Giles at that time, but certainly Rupert was the main focus. And we didn't get anywhere in the conversations with Richard Desmond and a couple of lieutenants that we used to meet with quite regularly. So we pulled back from the purchase and we started renegotiating a 5-year royalty license with them. We went in at a 15-16% level with certain guarantees to reinforce it. And Richard Desmond came in at 25% plus level. He wanted us to pay royalties of 25% plus. At the time, and I don't believe for a moment it would make sense today, it made no commercial sense to do so. So cutting a long story short, after a period of probably 4 or 5 months of back and forward and purchasing it in total, and separately in getting a new royalty contract from the then Express newspapers, we just decided, unfortunately, there was nowhere else to go, so we closed the discussion and went away with great sadness, because it's hard to, you guys probably more than anyone know the commitment to Rupert. My commitment to Rupert started off really as a kiddie, in a very casual way. It then kind of matured, and I would be wrong to say that it was my number one priority back in 1992. But Rupert's got a funny way of sort of, inveigling his way into your whole sort of makeup. And we had some wonderful things. There weren't always, there was a lot of frustrations as well along the way, but we had some absolutely wonderful times. The times when we'd be arguing the toss with Ian about how a storyline should go, and you wondered the following day why you got so worked up about, whether he should have an upturned umbrella or whether, to fly in or not, seems ridiculous. But that was the way it was. So with great sadness, we walked away. I feel a bit of a fraud being here, because the last time we published Rupert was in 2003. That's a lifetime ago by most standards. But fortuitously, John and we have kept in touch over that period. And you guys have kindly invited me to a couple of the AGMs and the conventions. I think the last one I came to was about 5 years ago, something like that, 5-6 years ago, in Warwick University, which is also another great venue as well for it. since 2003, there's been good things. There's a lot that I don't agree with, but then, you know, I only have to look at Matt Hancock, the former health secretary, to realise there's a hell of a lot of life I don't agree with these days, you know. My old grandfather, my mum was English, grandpa was a Midlander, and he used to sit in front of the television set and have a discussion or an argument with the people on the set. And although I adored my grandfather, I used to think, what a silly old codger. History is repeating itself. And Matt Hancock came on the television, and the other one, Williamson. Here's I'm digressing here. But when either of them come on the television, I can see my grandfather looking down at me, saying, what a silly old codger. But there's been good things done with Rupert. I think it was too prescriptive, it was too formulaic what happened. Following 2003, Express newspapers weren't able to persuade any other publisher to pay them the exorbitant royalty that they were looking for. And again, as you guys know better than I do, for a number of years, 4 years, 5 years until 2007, Express newspapers published the Rupert themselves. They weren't equipped to handle the retail side of it. We did a lot of promotion with retailers. We had good relationships with a lot of the retailers. All of that's changed as well. I mean, in those days, people like W.H. Smiths and Waterstones and Dillons and Hudson's, you know, all of these bookshops were supreme. You know, they've now been taken over by Aldi and Lidl, and I mean that for annuals. You know, I would say now, between Aldi and Lidl, probably 25% of the annual market today is done by Aldi and Lidl. You know, W.H. Smith sadly are a shadow of their former self. People like Smith's Toys in Ireland are big annual punters, and they do a lot with that. I'm not familiar whether they've got Rupert under Eggman. And what I would call the new Woolworths. Woolworths used to do a lot with us. A lot with annuals, and I was a great supporter of Woolworths. I thought there were lots of detractors, but I thought there was a lot of wonderful parts to Woolworths as well as a few crappy parts, you know. And now you've got the new Woolworths on the block. You've got things like Home Bargains, TJ Morris, you know. These people, they're not to be sneezed at. These characters are the latter day Tesco's and the latter day Woolworths, you know. Just they end up maturing as the world moves on. So the market today is completely different. But in 2005, entertainment rights, now part of Universal, entertainment rights, to the best of my knowledge, paid about 6 million. So a lot more than we were offering, paid about 6 million for a 2/3 stake in Woolworths from Express newspapers. And Express newspapers retained certain rights to it. And it was largely through entertainment rights that the deal was struck with Egmont in 2007. And as best I know, John, I think from then until now, Egmont have remained the publisher for Rupert. Unusually, John's not saying anything from the back there. He normally corrects me. Oh, is he gone? I thought you said he was going to sleep. That also happens a lot of the times when I'm something to do. Anyway, I think that's right. Egmont, you know, you can't be a spectre at the feast. You know, there are lots of things that I don't think are handled as well. I thought the animation that was done for Rupert was very poor. It really didn't depict, you know, what I think Rupert, the best of Rupert is. And I, again, slightly disagree with John. There are very profound challenges. The world of brands, the world of characters has been turned on its head in the last 10 years. It's a bit like nowadays, you know, I want to be a celebrity. You know, I don't necessarily want a talent, I just want to be a celebrity. And that's a little bit like the field of cartoons, the field of characters, all of these things are changing. There is something very, very magical about Rupert and his chums. Now he's been around since 1920 or something like that. With Mary Goodell, gone through Alfred Bestall and the John Harolds of this world, and with some wonderful storylines written by some of them, and also by people like Ian Robinson as well. Some great storylines. I still believe that stands the test of time, and I think it is quite remarkable if you've actually got a good manager running the business. In other words, Egmont are perfectly capable. They're very, very successful publishers, but somehow I don't think they've had their focus on the core annual, and I don't think they've had their focus as much as I think they perhaps might have done in terms of Rupert as a character. I would love to see Rupert being handled in a slightly more sensitive way, because I think it's all there to be done. If you're Disney taking Rupert, to me that would be the most wonderful partnership, and that is a perfect combination. So who knows what the next 100 years? I mean, Rupert's been very resilient, and Rupert's had and chums, Bill and all the rest of them they've had their issues and the problems. Every generation thinks that their problems is the worst problems. In the 1990s, we thought we were facing the demise of Rupert then. I'd like to think in some way, some of the things that we did during the 90s and into the early 2000s stimulated the interest of people at Entertainment Rights to come in and pay what was a very considerable sum of money in 2005 for the rights, and that was only for 2/3 of the rights, of Rupert. So who knows what's ahead. Rupert's a hard worker, and for my money, I think with a fair wind, I think there's a reasonable chance that Rupert will continue from here, and there'll be other generations of followers, maybe not other generations of Jerry Reynolds, but there'll be other generations of followers in places like this talking about Rupert in another 10, 20, 30 years from now. So that's us. For me, it's brought up to date. I can't say too much about the detail of Rupert today, because if you'd asked me, I brought all the covers. I've got all the covers here. So if anybody wants to quiz me on some of the background to that, I'd be delighted to do that after we've had this. But I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight to more the commercial relationships and the things that took place over a period of 12, 13 years, which is a long, long time. Anyway, so that's it. But if you want to ask me any questions, I'll do my very best to answer. Over to you.
You touch on the you touch on your romantic association from your childhood. That's fantastic. Do you think that sort of relationship exists in today's publishing world of all sorts of publications of their own?
That's a very good question. Bear in mind, I'm retired now, and it's remarkable how quickly when you retire, the world moves on. I think there are too many. What tends to happen now is everything's prescriptive, and it's all about how many shows you're going to have and social media and all the rest of it. It used to be within the toy business, every year, and this is a bad way perhaps of answering it, every year, whether you liked it or not, there was genuinely new product development coming through every single year. If I look at the publishing industry and I look at the toy industry, particularly in the children's area I'm talking about now, it's more repeats of the same. It's more clones of what's there, because what tends to happen is that the financiers of these and the media people, when they've got a formula that they think works, they then want to try and maximise that. So I don't think there is the romance. I don't think there is the scope. I think too much in today's world, we talk a good case about freedom, and romance and freedom of expression and new, but you start to get involved with that, you find that you're either terribly lucky or very unusual if you can take something that's a real kernel of newness and drive it through. Sadly.
Jerry, what would you say was the economic print run for a Rupert annual to break even and make a bit of money? And do you think that the current Rupert annual is achieving that sort of production?
Right, okay. The publishing industry relies on publishing industry figures, Nielsen, etc., etc. The problem with publishing industry figures, it's really looking at a bygone age. It ignores the Aldis and the Lidls of this world. It ignores the T.J. Morrises, the new Woolworths on the block. So it's very, very difficult when you read the Nielsen figures to get an accurate reflection of what the true volume is. I've not looked, John, at Nielsen probably for the last couple of years because I don't really trust it. So because of that, I don't really look at it. I think it had its day, but now I don't think it's particularly reliable. It's maybe reliable in what I would call technical titles, you know, which only find their way through certain stores. In the UK, they generally reckon, and it's still the same today, that between 7,500 and 10,000 units of a hardback are the average print that's brought out for UK consumption. For an annual, the dynamics are different, the economics are different. We used to reckon that if we did less than 25,000 copies, we couldn't break even. Because annuals are more commercial, you know, what you're doing, you're employing artists. Forget, to some extent, what happened with Rupert. With Rupert, we separately paid Express a fee for the stories and for the artworks associated with it. So we paid a royalty, which was effectively for the adoption of the character, and we then paid for the hardware that went in to the annuals in a separate thing. We would probably pay in those days the best part of about 25,000 for the stories and the artwork. Now that's got to be 40,000, you know, by any start, 45,000. But it's a commercial world. What happens now is it's a bit like forgot his name, Richard Desmond. That's I prefer to forget his name. It's a bit like Richard Desmond. There's people who've got lots of chutzpah these days in business, and they will come and ask you for 100,000 for the artwork, you know, and there's no way you can make commercial sense of it. So in a laboured way of answering your question, I don't know what Egmont do. I would be surprised if Egmont were doing more than about 40,000 to 50,000 Rupert annuals now, sadly. And I suspect, given their overhead structure, they're probably not making money from it. We used to have about 25,000 would be the level, and that had to roll into it, not just our studio and the editorial, because you've still got those as fixed overheads in any event that you've got to amortize, but also the money you're paying by way of royalty and what you're paying for exterior artists and writers as well. So 20, 25,000 probably now, break even. Print costs have gone up, royalties percentages have gone up since then, but I would have thought probably about 25,000. The problem you've got is that the recommended retail price of an annual, by and large, has remained about £7.50, something like that. But the absolute sale price of an annual will not be more than about £2.99, £3.99 for an annual now, and that's been like that for 20 years. You know, so it kind of demonstrates, it's a bit like back to Express newspapers and Richard Desmond taking over. You know, at a time, the printing industry was a recipe for making a lot of money, you know, when you had reasonable volumes associated with it. That world has changed. The cost of print has rocketed. You know, they'll probably be paying now, what is that, 96 page or 112? I can't remember. What is the page count for a Rupert annual now? 112? about 112. They will be paying now for, and it will be decent quality paper. I mean, Egmont are not a fly-by-night company. They're a proper publisher. Although I don't think they've done a great job with Rupert, that's a separate thing. But Egmont will probably be paying their printers about £1 a copy for the print alone. If you then add the royalty onto that, you then add the margin. And if you work in the principal, let's say it's £3.99, £4. The average margin that most retailers will expect to get is between 50 and 60%. So although there's no VAT on it, you're down at about £1.40, £1.50, sorry, £2, £1.90, £2. Off that you've got £1 for the print. You've then got all your other costs. You've got your royalty. You know, your royalty, you're probably paying less. You're probably paying more percentage royalty now, but less in absolute terms because of the way that the net invoice prices come down into the trade. So, you know, if you're only doing 25,000, you'll be lucky to be breaking even by the time you've done that. You've given the trade the margin and so on and so forth. You really need in an annual, I would say, if you're getting north of 50, 60,000, you're starting to make commercial sense of it. And if you're up where we were at about 140, I think was the last figures that I recall, you're up at about 140, you're making very good money. Very good money.
I'm afraid to say, that's fantastic, Joe.